Our objective now is going to be identifying congruent triangles and their relationships. Let's start off by defining what we mean by congruent. Here I have two lines. Each one is 16 inches long. So I'm going to say that this is side 1, and I'll call this one side 2. And as you can see, the measure of side 1 equals the measure of side 2. But if I take this side up and put it on top of side 2, it's going to be an exact match. And so because of that, we will say that side 1 is congruent to side 2. So when the measures are the same, we say it's equal. But when we talk about the actual parts, that we can take one part and put it right on top of the other part and have an exact match, that is what we mean by congruent. Now, when two triangles are congruent, that means that the corresponding sides are congruent and the corresponding angles are congruent. And notice how I've labeled the sides. Side AB and side DE each have one tick mark. That's because they are corresponding sides. If I take side AB and put it right on top of side DE, it would be an exact match. So I'm saying that side AB is going to be congruent to side DE. Notice BC and EF each have two tick marks. So BC is going to be congruent to EF. And lastly, AC and DF each have three tick marks. So I will show that AC and DF are also congruent. And notice my congruent sign has an equal sign with a little squiggly line on top. So that satisfies that the corresponding sides are congruent, and I said also the corresponding angles are congruent. So in other words, angle 1 is going to be congruent to angle 2, angle B is going to be congruent to angle E, and angle C is going to be congruent to angle F. Now, notice in these two figures I showed that each side was congruent to each corresponding side of the other triangle, and that each angle was congruent to the corresponding angle of the other figure. However, we don't have to show that every side and every angle are congruent in order to show that the triangles are congruent. In certain circumstances, if certain sides and angles are congruent, then it is understood that all the sides and all the angles are going to be congruent. Let's take a look at our first one, where we have triangle ABC and triangle DEF. Notice I have the tick marks 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. All I have indicated is that the sides are congruent. And if this is the case, then the triangles are going to be congruent. That means that triangle ABC is going to be congruent to triangle DEF. Now, I want you to notice that this is side, 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 and we abbreviate it by SSS. So, even though I didn't tell you that the corresponding angles are congruent, it's understood that the corresponding angles are congruent because the sides are congruent. Let's take a look at our second set of triangles. Notice I have one tick mark on these corresponding sides, and I have two tick marks on this corresponding sides, and I've also indicated that the angles are congruent. This is called side, angle, side. Side, angle, side. And when you have a situation like this, then the triangles are going to be congruent. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. And just by showing that in this order, side, angle, side, that those two sides and this angle in the middle are congruent, all the sides are going to be congruent, and all the corresponding sides are going to be congruent, and all of the corresponding angles are going to be congruent, because triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. And lastly, let's take a look at this limited amount of information that they give us. Angle, angle, side. The corresponding angles D and A E and B, and then the corresponding side, BC and EF, are congruent. If you can show that those are congruent, then the triangles are congruent. In other words, this is angle, angle, side, and this is the abbreviation AAS. If you can show that this is the situation, then triangle ABC is going to be congruent to triangle DEF. All right, now, with that in mind, let's solve for x in our next example. Well, before we can show that we can solve, before we can solve for x, we have to make sure that the triangles are congruent. Because if the triangles are not congruent, then the corresponding sides are not going to be congruent. Let's see what we have. We have AC is congruent to DF. So those two corresponding sides are congruent. The corresponding angles are congruent. And this second side, BC, and this second side, EF, their corresponding sides, they are also congruent. So therefore, my triangle is going to be congruent because of side, angle, side. Now that I have shown that my triangles are congruent, I can solve for AB and DE. Now, I know that because the sides are congruent, that means that side AB is congruent to side DE. And that means, of course, that if I take this side AB and put it right on top of DE, it's going to be a perfect match. Now, because that's going to be a perfect match, that also means that the measures of the sides are going to be the same. So that means the measure of AB is going to equal the measure of DE. So we have shown that the triangles are congruent, the sides are congruent, and that means their measures are going to be the same. So my measure of AB is 2x plus 4. My measure of DE is 3x minus 5. And now all we have left to do is to solve for x, which is what they asked us to do. So I'm going to eliminate my 2x by adding a negative 2x to each side. That gives me 4 equals x minus 5. Now I'm going to add a positive 5 to each side. And that gives me 9 equals x. And that is what they asked for, solve the value of x. In the next example, we're going to solve the value of the side. But we always start off by solving for x first. I'm not sure if I showed all this, but here are the two triangles. This is side AB is congruent to side DE because we have shown that the triangles are congruent. That means the measures over here are going to be the same. So I put the value of the sides here, and then I solve for x. All right. Now, we're going to solve for the value of AB and DE. But before we can start, we're going to have to make sure our triangles are congruent. And notice the tick marks indicate that the corresponding sides are the same. So therefore, I know that my triangles are congruent because of side, side, side. Now, as I stated before, we're going to have to solve for x first before we can solve for the value of one of the sides. So my first step is to find x. All right, this tells me that AB is congruent to DE, and because the sides are congruent, that means the measures are going to be the same. So the measure of AB is going to equal the measure of DE. And the measure of AB is 3x minus 7, and the measure of DE is 2x plus 5. So I'm going to solve now. I'm going to add a negative 2x on each side, and this gives me x minus 7 equals 5. And now I'm going to add a positive 7 to each side. And that gives me x equals 12. Now that is my first step to solve for x. Now we've solved problems like this before, and what we said was once we get our value for x, that we're going to put it in our easier expression. So we have a choice of 3x minus 7 or 2x plus 5. And so I'm going to take the 2x plus 5. So I'm going to solve for DE. And it doesn't matter which one I solve for, because you see, since these sides are congruent, the measures are also going to be the same. So I'm going to solve for the measure of DE, and that is equal to 2x plus 5. And now I'm going to substitute 12 for x, so that's 2 times 12 plus 5, which gives me 24 plus 5, which gives me 29. So DE is 29 and AB is 29. They each have one tick mark. They're congruent, so therefore their measures are the same. Let's take a look at our last problem. And this time, we're going to solve for our angles. Notice, first of all, we have to say, are the triangles congruent? And look what I have. Angle, angle, side, angle, angle, side. So because of angle, angle, side, my triangles are congruent. That means that the corresponding angles, all the corresponding angles are going to be the same, and all the corresponding sides are going to be the same. So I have angle C is congruent to angle F, which means the measure of angle C equals the measure of angle F. The measure of angle C is 4x minus 17 equals, and the measure of angle F is 2x plus 15. Okay, we're going to eliminate the 2x first. So I'm going to add a negative 2x or subtract 2x from both sides. And that gives me 2x minus 17 equals 15. Now I'm going to add a positive 17 to both sides. And I'll continue it over here. And that's going to give me 2x equals 32. I divide each side by 2. And that gives me x equals 16. Now that's part 1, where I had to solve for x. Part 2 is where I'm going to solve for the measure of angle C or the measure of angle F. I have a choice. And as I said, we always are going to pick the easier of the two. So the measure of angle F equals 2x plus 15. So that's going to be 2 times 16 plus 15, which is 32 plus 15, which gives me 47. And actually we know it's going to be 47 degrees. So based on our relationship that we have with our congruent sides, if we can get side, 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 angle, side, or angle, angle, side, we can show that the triangles are going to be congruent. And if the triangles are congruent, the corresponding sides are going to be congruent, the corresponding angles are going to be congruent, and their measures are going to be equal.